On the pagan wheel of the year, Samhain is a cross-quarters holiday, approximately halfway between the fall equinox and the winter solstice. It's the pagan New Year. In the book Circle Round, Raising Children in Goddess Traditions, Stephen Posh writes, the cross-quarters, the holidays in between solstices and equinoxes, all have traditional door rituals associated with them. At Samhain, of course, the trick-or-treaters come to the door and we give them something to eat. At Beltane, the unnamed presences return to the door and leave May baskets full of flowers. So there's a balance struck. At Samhain, a gifting out. At Beltane, return gifting in the other direction. Posh continues, I have another favorite door ritual for Samhain, an old Irish-Scottish tradition that kids love. Just at sunset on Halloween, we rush to the back door, throw it open, and send out the old year. We slam the door closed and lock it to lock in the luck. Then we rush to the front door, throw it open, and welcome the new year, usually scaring a few trick-or-treaters in the process. We grab horns and noisemakers and run through the whole house, making a cacophonous racket to scare away the nasties. Until I read that, I had forgotten that among the Halloween paraphernalia of my own childhood were metal noisemakers. One was shaped like a maraca. I think it had a black cat on it and was shaken. And another had a top that whirled around the bottom, making a whirring noise. I don't remember that we were scaring out the evil spirits, but we made noise. At Samhain, the veil between the land of the living and the land of the dead is said to be thin. Lanterns are set out to guide the beloved dead home. In Europe, they were in turnips. Here in America, they're in pumpkins. Again, in the book Circle Round, Raising Children in Goddess Traditions, Starhawk writes, in my house, we celebrate Samhain with an ancestor feast, similar to what we saw on our interlude video. She says, on the day of the feast, each of us prepares some special food that our ancestors liked. My ancestors are Ukrainian Jews, so I often make a beet soup called borscht. Other people in the house have ancestors from England, Poland, West Africa, Germany, Holland, France, and many other places, so we have quite a variety of things to eat for dinner. Before we eat, we take a little bit of food from each dish and put it on a plate. We put the plate on the altar in front of the pictures of our beloved dead and light the candles. We speak to them. Ancestors, beloved dead, you who gave us our lives, this food is for you. We give back to you. We remember you, and so you live on. Join us now. Feast with us. Visit us in our dreams. We love you. Blessed be. After dinner, we sit back in comfortable chairs near the altar, and each person tells a story about the ancestors. The story might be about someone in their family, or a traditional myth or folk tale of their people. We pass around photos of our beloved dead and talk about them, or play tapes of their voices. Usually at Samhain, as I prepare the sermon, I think the most of the beloved dead, our family and friends now gone. This year, I might have thought that this would be particularly so, since tomorrow will be the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death. But that is not where my mind is most focused this year. Instead, my mind is with the nasties that we banish from our houses with a cacophony of noise. My mother is dead a year and of natural causes after I had her in my life well into my 60s. But the deaths that are haunting me this year are the ones from Israel and Gaza that have ceaselessly been reported to me through my radio. Fortunately for me, I don't watch television because the radio reports were graphic enough for me without seeing pictures. Back on October 11th, Fatma Tanis reported for NPR. What happened last weekend was unprecedented in its scale and coordination. Militants attacked Israeli communication towers with improvised explosives. They breached the Gaza-Israel border fence within minutes and assumed control of several Israeli communities. They paraglided over the border and gunned down civilians at a music festival. Hamas killed at least 1,200 people in the attack and took dozens hostage, including women, children, and the elderly, all while Israel's military was late to respond. It was the deadliest attack Israel has seen in decades. In retaliation, Israel has laid siege to Gaza with hundreds of airstrikes that have killed at least 1,000 Palestinians and displaced more than 200,000 people. It has cut off electricity, food, and fuel supplies. That is more than nasties. Those are atrocities. Judith Lewis Herman, an American psychiatrist, researcher, and teacher, says, the ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. These more than nasties, these atrocities will not be banished. It is these ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told who are haunting me now. And am I brave enough to hear the bloody, gory, horrible stories of their deaths? Part of me wants to bring out the noisemakers and drown out those stories. But folk wisdom tells us that we will not be rid of those ghosts until we tell their stories. And these ghosts have a long history of stories of trauma. These stories did not begin this month. No, the Jews have a history of trauma rooted in pogroms and the Holocaust. The Palestinians have a history of trauma rooted in the Nakba, their permanent displacement, and generations of living as refugees. Nakba means disaster, catastrophe, or cataclysm. Holocaust comes from the word for the Jewish sacrificial offering that was burned completely on the altar, thus complete destruction. The dead of today's war cannot be put to rest without confronting the current trauma and the traumas of the past. The long conflict between Israel and those who say they are fighting for the Palestinian cause will not be resolved until both sides are truly able to hear all of the other's story. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Nelson Mandela authorized and Bishop Desmond Tutu chaired after apartheid ended in South Africa was about all sides publicly telling their stories. Victims from various parties and perpetrators from various parties all came before the commission. People disagree about how effective the commission was, but the effort was made. People told their stories, and some, at least, from all sides, listened. As Herman said, folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. I was intrigued, fascinated to see a book for sale on Amazon that I have not yet bought or read, but it looked like an attempt to tell the stories. Its title is Love Israel, Support Palestine. It is by Nir Avishai Cohen. The blurb for the book reads in part, Nir is a different kind of Israeli, one who cannot be ignored. In his book, he confronts the reader with his Israeli identities, his Jewish heritage as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, his military identity as an officer who takes up arms and defends his country, and his humane identity as a citizen fighting for human rights and the rights of his Palestinian neighbors. It sounds like he is telling his story and is open to hearing the Palestinian story. But right now, no one's listening to stories. Both sides are out fighting monsters. Those monsters will not be seen as human until their stories are heard. Is there any hope of that? In my most negative moments, I might think not. But on one of the pages of the website for the Unitarian Universalist Trauma Response Ministry is a piece by Václav Havel, Czech author, statesman, and poet, last president of Czechoslovakia and first president of the Czech Republic. His piece is titled Hope. He writes, hope is a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. Hope is not a prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit. You can't delegate that to anyone else. Hope is this deep and powerful sense. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy when things are going well, or the willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed to early success, but rather an ability to work for something to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It is hope above all that gives us strength to live and to continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. In the face of this absurdity, life is too precious a thing to permit its devaluation by living pointlessly, emptily, without meaning, without love, and finally, without hope. It's Samhain, and the dead are haunting me. They will not be banished, but as war rages, I cling to hope. A hope that someday stories will not just be told, but will also be heard, and the monsters will become seen as fellow humans, and the first steps will be taken toward peace. On Wednesday night, I thought this sermon was written And except for the closing prayer, it ended here. I would have Thursday to make final edits, prepare my notes, and practice before recording it on Friday morning for the other congregation. But then I woke up Thursday morning to the news of another mass shooting, this time in Lewiston, Maine. It is one of more than 500 mass shootings in our own country so far this year. We know the stories. Someone was fired, someone's partner broke up with them, someone feels bullied, someone has been convinced that the Jews, the Blacks, the Muslims, the Hispanics, the immigrants are responsible for their and the world's troubles. The ghosts of those killed here should be haunting us and haunting our legislatures. But we seem to have been all too successful in drowning them out with a cacophony of other noises. Perhaps we should put markers for all those killed this year or in the last 5 years or in the last 20 years on the Capitol lawns of our states and our nation. But I would not put rest and peace on those markers. Something is required of us before we can say those words. We need to do some things for these dead. We need to expand our mental health services. We need to reform our gun laws. We need to address hate speech and keep it from escalating into incitement to violence. Our legislators may need to actually do most of this, but we citizens need to demand it. We have a responsibility to the dead. They are with us. They demand it. Let us pray. With words from Unitarian Universalist minister Amy Petrie Shaw. For all who die in war, please say, we lift up our hearts. We lift up our hearts. For all who live in suffering in the aftermath of violence, we lift up our hearts. For all who give their lives in smoke and flame, we lift up our hearts. For all who go on in honor of the dead, we lift up our hearts. For all who have served, we lift up our hearts. For our country and our world, we lift up our hearts. For a planet that will find peace, we lift up our hearts. For the young and the innocent, we lift up our hearts. For the weary and war-torn, we lift up our hearts. For those who would pray, we lift up our hearts. For those too angry to cry, we lift up our hearts. For all of us, for the many names of God, we lift up our hearts. We lift up our hearts. Shanti, Shalom, peace, Salam. Amen.